Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second day of American Art and the Political Imagination. We're thrilled to be back with you today to explore the role of art and visual culture in the political imagination of the United States of America. I'm Louis Shadwick. I'm an associate lecturer here at the Courtauld, and I'm just about to complete my PhD on the work of Edward Hopper. I'm now working on a new biography of Hopper due to be published by Yale University Press in 2024.
My name is Dr. Madeline Harrison. I'm also an associate lecturer here at the Courtauld, where I finished my PhD in 2021. And I'm soon to be the 2022 to 23 Terra Foundation postdoctoral research fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And my research is into the visual cultures of the Harlem Renaissance. Louis and I are not going to take up too much of your time here today. We'll really just cover a few very brief, important logistical bits for those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday.
So a quick reminder of some housekeeping. Each paper will be 20 minutes long and each panel will include 3 papers today, followed by a Q&A of around 20 minutes after each panelist has spoken. Please ask your questions during the Q&A by posting them in the chat. I think the chat will be open throughout as well, so post questions when you have them. And then during the Q&A, the panel chair will pose your question to the speakers on your behalf. Our first panel today will be followed by a 20-minute break, and after our second panel, we're going to head straight into our keynote from Professor Sarah Churchwell, which will be kicking off at around 5 p.m. There will be time for a Q&A after Sarah's keynote as well, so please again ask any questions you have in the chat, and we should be finishing up today around 6:15 p.m. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Alice Butler, our first chair for today. Alice Butler is the Terra Foundation Center for American Art postdoctoral fellow at the Courtauld Institute of Art for 2021 to 2022. An interdisciplinary writer and scholar, Alice specializes in the intersections of queer feminist art and writing practices of the 1970s and 1980s to explore questions of sickness, sexuality, and gender via intersectional feminist and queer perspectives and experimental embodied approaches to archive and auto theory. So over to you, Alice.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louis, and thank you, Madeline, for organising this wonderful event. I'm delighted to chair this panel with 3 papers that promise original, thought-provoking ways of thinking and rethinking the politics of materiality. First, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Johnson. Elizabeth Johnson is Henry Moore Foundation postdoctoral fellow at University College London, where she is researching how contemporary artists are using digital technologies to pioneer new socially engaged models of monumentality. Her writing has been published in Sculpture Journal and the Whitechapel MIT Documents of Contemporary Art series on The Object. Her forthcoming article on the virtual aesthetics of early artist holograms is due to be published in Archives of American Art Journal, and her essay on monuments as wireless transmitters will feature in the forthcoming edited volume, The Sculptural in the Post-Digital Age. Today, Elizabeth will be presenting her paper, Augmented Reality Monuments in LA, Redefining the Monument's Political Power and Presence in Public Space. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. I'm really thrilled to welcome you and looking forward to your paper. I'll hand over.
So I'd like to start by thanking Louis and Maddie for organising this conference, and to all of yesterday's speakers for what was a really fascinating first day. The research that I'm going to present today is a portion of a book that I'm researching at the moment on digital monuments. And this is just a very small section of the work. In summer 2020, the monument's explosive power as a political symbol made headlines across the United States. Monuments recognized as symbols of white supremacy were daubed with graffiti, pelted with paint, defaced and felled at protests across the country. Direct action during Black Lives Matter protests was followed by a more orderly choreography of cranes, lifting a further series of statues from plinths on the instructions of officials who had not acted earlier. This spate of spontaneous and sanctioned monument removals was part of a wave of global racial activism accelerated by the murder of George Floyd on the 25th of May. Many monuments that had stood like pillars, openly upholding this continuing logic of white supremacy in public life, were swept away by the outpourings of rage and sorrow at the routinely inhumane treatment of racialized people. Despite the spate of removals, a much greater quantity of public monuments linked to histories of violence and oppression still stood on the nation's streets, and a heated public debate ensued over the future of public monuments. In the wake of the protests, augmented reality emerged as a rapid and economical means to visualize a more multivocal landscape of public monuments. So augmented reality is viewed through a device, normally a smartphone, and it incorporates real-time inputs such as a live video feed to overlay digital information on top of its user's physical environment. So a quick point of reference for us here is anyone who's played the game Pokemon Go or seen the bunny ears in Snapchat. This is what I'm talking about when I'm referring to augmented reality, these types of technologies. Augmented reality enabled artists, activists, and educators to make timely interventions in the public debate on monuments and offer their visions of a new culture of monumentality. While it might take years or decades to see through a physical monument commission, that is, if it succeeds at all, in the wake of the protest, a handful of apps enabled scores of augmented reality monuments to be created and exhibited in a matter of months. Potential barriers to physically constructing monuments posed by cost, political and public opposition, and prohibitive laws are overcome in a few taps of a screen. The plethora of self-defined augmented reality monuments that have emerged in the last 2 years is too numerous for me to get into in this detail, so these slides have just shown you a few examples. Yet what tends to unite them is this desire to challenge the cultural hegemony of the colonial and Confederate monuments that were targeted by the protests of summer 2020. One augmented reality project to emerge in the wake of these protests was Monumental Perspectives, and this is a series of virtual monuments commissioned by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in collaboration with the social media platform Snap, who were formerly known as Snapchat. And they'd really paved the way in popularizing augmented reality in 2015. Monumental Perspectives launched in April 2021, and it featured augmented reality monuments by artists including I.R. Back, Mercedes Dorame, Glenn Kino, Ruben Ochoa, and Ada Pinkston. Viewed via the Snap app on the viewer's smartphone, the commissions are intended to be viewed at specific sites across Los Angeles, but they're also available anywhere in the world. And the goal of using augmented reality to challenge the cultural hegemony of the city's monuments is apparent in the press release LACMA released alongside the project, which claimed the resulting commissions would, and I'm going to quote here, celebrate diverse histories in an effort to reflect richer and more inclusive perspectives from communities across the region. So my critical project as an art historian is to contend that digitally engaged contemporary art practice can't be addressed as autonomous artworks on their own, but they have to really be recognized as participants in vast digital ecologies. And by this, I mean the global scale material and technical infrastructures and political economies that support these systems. And so in this light, augmented reality monuments not only visualize particular political imaginaries, but they're active participants in a political ecosystem. What remains of this paper is going to be divided into two parts. So in the first part, I'm going to focus on one of the commissions that emerged from Monumental Perspectives and suggest it really creatively engages the formal structure of augmented reality to offer a new vision of monumentality that responds to the changing discourse of monuments signaled by the protests. And in the second part of the paper, I will move beyond this lens of art history and start to draw from the literature of digital media studies to suggest that the recent surge of augmented reality monuments not only symbolize a more heterogeneous political imaginary, but also have the potential to be instrumentalized in service of an ever-expanding regime of surveillance capitalism. In Los Angeles, decades of campaigning by grassroots Indigenous activists had laid the foundation for the removal of a number of colonial monuments. So, for example, in June 2020, we saw at Placita Olvera in downtown LA, it was stripped of its monument commemorating Junepo Serra, a Franciscan friar who'd been an architect of the colonial mission system in the 18th century, which had decimated California's indigenous culture. And this action followed an earlier removal in 2018 of a monument to Christopher Columbus from Grand Park in another peaceful and sanctioned ceremony. The colonial monument removals advanced the question of how the landscape of public monuments might be reimagined from different indigenous perspectives. And one of the 5 commissions to emerge from monumental perspectives that uses augmented reality to answer this question is called Portal for Tavanga by the artist Mercedes Dorame. Portal for Tavanga harnesses augmented reality's formal structure as an overlay of digital information on top of the physical environment, and it uses it to attend to history and place as a series of overlays. So its title, Portal for Tavanga, alerts its viewers to the physical overlay of the modern city of Los Angeles on the land known as Tavanga by the Tongva people, who are indigenous to the Los Angeles Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. Although members of the Tongva, such as Dorame, continue to live in the area of their ancestral homeland, the tribe are not recognized federally. And this means that they don't possess any federal land on which to gather. I think perhaps there's too neat an allegory to be found here between this aspect of Tongva politics and augmented reality's presence without concrete place. Launch Portal for Tavanga using Snap at its intended sites on LACMA's grounds. Look through the smartphone's eye, and a mottled blue disc is superimposed on the museum's gravel drive. The disc's impasto surface is patterned with pale diagrammatic marks, characteristic of the cosmic maps that feature in Dorame's previous sculptural installations. The disc rotates slowly, evoking the star's nightly passage across the sky, and it points to this kind of cosmological consistency that's presided over the site throughout its past as Tavanga, present as Los Angeles, and into its future. The disc's rotation is echoed by the cyclical analog crackle and looping melody of Dorame and her daughter singing a Tongva language song. Dorame intended Portal for Tavanga to be viewed outside LACMA, adjacent to the La Brea tar pits, where natural asphalt has seeped to the surface of the earth for tens of thousands of years. The tar pits represent one of few locations in Los Angeles that hasn't been covered over by a concrete crust of decades of modern urbanization, and they were a really important natural resource for the historical Tongva communities. So by citing the monument's deep blue portal by the tar pit's dark pools, what I want to suggest is that Dorame mobilizes augmented reality not as a monument itself, but as an overlay that frames the land itself as a form of monument. The augmented reality image is posed as the latest in a series of overlays of human and geological history that were previously laminated into the land. Portal for Tavanga awakens an understanding of the land as a palimpsest of history and memory, while also bringing to the fore the continuing contemporary Tongva presence in Los Angeles. It engages augmented reality's peculiar formal properties to consider the past in relation to an ongoing and irreconcilable struggle for existence at the threshold of erasure and endurance. For all that really talented artists like Dorame are able to mobilize augmented reality to generate these new visions of monumental imagery, I suggest it's crucial to recognize that these types of virtual monuments are not only symbolic of a politics, but have the potential to be instrumentalized by a new politics of public space. In her 2019 book, Race After Technology, sociologist Ruha Benjamin suggests it's important to prototype technological innovations so that we might, and I'm quoting here, better anticipate and intervene in new racial formations that, like shiny new gadgets, may appear to be a kind of radical alternative, but may very well entail their own logics of subjugation. So the artists who were really seduced by the novelty of augmented reality must also consider how their work participates in the economy of what social psychologist Shoshana Zuboff describes as surveillance capitalism. So in her 2019 magnum opus, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, Zuboff outlines a theory of an economy in which human experience serves as the free raw material that is translated into behavioral data and monetized in this market of behavioral prediction. And Zuboff describes how the unquenchable thirst for new sources of this data necessitates an increasing extension of extraction operations from the virtual world into the real world, with the future wealth of surveillance capitalist companies dependent upon new supply routes that extend into life on the roads, among the trees, and throughout the cities. And one of these new supply routes that Zuboff mentions is augmented reality, which has the potential to supply these big tech companies with a continuous source of behavioral surplus produced by monitoring users' smartphone activity. So audience who are wishing to view monumental perspectives must be willing to download the Snap app and create an account. And here they're entering into the type of asymmetrical exchange, which is now all too familiar to many of us. In this case, in which access to Snap and the augmented reality monument is exchanged for personal information and consent to ongoing surveillance and data mining. But less familiar to many people is the way that the live video feed and GPS mapping that augmented reality depends on also provide the platform with fresh data to elaborate the mapping of interior and exterior public and private spaces. So as users run augmented reality software in their homes and on the streets, they're supplying corporations with data about physical locations that are really beyond the reach of the Google Maps streetcars that we've seen. So when I launched Portal for Tavanga in my living room, for instance, and this is not my living room, this is a mock-up of an IKEA advert with Portal for Tavanga in it, and Snap accumulates a previously untapped yield of data about my private home. Viewing monumental perspectives is conditional on consenting to one's aesthetic encounter being harnessed in service of the operations of surveillance capitalism. And here we shift from the realm of a political imaginary into an actual politics of space. Art historian Paul Farber claims, monuments operate as statements of power and presence in public space. So the presence of the augmented reality monument in the virtual landscape is alerting us to a new notion of public space. That is the layer of virtual data overlaid on specific physical locations. And it's this linking of digital data to the physical landscape that's the ultimate goal of augmented reality. So geolocated augmented reality has the potential to produce what digital media theorist Benjamin H. Bratton describes as an aggressive subtitling of the phenomenal world, and that's capable of directing our interactions within it. And this is so, it's such a huge shift in the way that vision works. So no longer will there be this distance between our vision and interpretation. The interpretation of the world will be directly embedded into our vision. This is a really big shift in visuality and visual culture. So the first attempt to test at scale how geolocated augmented reality could be used to influence physical actions and events was this augmented reality game called Ingress. And this was released in 2013 and created by what was then a subsidiary of Google called Niantic Labs. Ingress is like a capture the flag game, and two teams battle it out. They rove the streets physically and battle it out for virtual control over public space. And they achieve that by capturing prominent public landmarks within the game, particularly public monuments and sculpture. So ingress mobilizes the symbolic power of the monument as a statement of ideological authority, and it recuperates it as the power accrued by the teams in the game. Niantic instrumentalized the battle for domination over public space that's being role-played in the game in a genuine battle for domination over the expanded public of geolocated augmented reality. Ingress enabled Niantic to test at scale how augmented reality could be used to manipulate people's behavior on the ground, so directing players' movements towards certain sites and strategically located points within the game. As technology corporations anticipate the mass uptake of wearable augmented reality technologies in the next decade through things like this is Meta, who were Facebook, their Project Aria augmented reality glasses. How might the physical manipulations tested in Ingress and its successor Pokemon Go be used in service of the agendas of those authoring the coming augmented reality regimes? How could augmented reality be used to direct its users to walk along a particular street and not another, or direct them into a certain shop based on their previous behaviors? How might augmented reality overlay the divisive politics, the divisive ideologies symbolized by the monuments targeted by the Black Lives Matter protests onto the world itself? So the possibility of such a partisan mode of vision leads back to the question of what it means to make a political statement, such as a monument, that is visible only to those who opt in to see it. And so to close, I want to emphasize that the extreme neoliberal politics of surveillance capitalism are not an inherent feature of augmented reality. And in 2021, there was another project which also came out of Los Angeles for augmented reality monuments, which was titled Encoding Futures, Speculative Monuments for LA. And this was launched by the community-based Los Angeles arts hub, Oxy Arts. So this project tasked 4 LA-based artists with using augmented reality to, and I'll quote from the press release, contemplate if and how new forms of monuments can reckon with the ways monuments have functioned as agents of oppression, end quote. So the resulting augmented reality monuments are hosted by this artist-made app that's specially for augmented reality art called Fourth Wall. And this does not monitor, collect, or monetize any of the information about its users for using the app. As artists increasingly engage with augmented reality to produce new visions of monumentality, often orientated towards racial and social justice, it's vital that they consider how their work intersects with an economy of surveillance capitalism, intent on using augmented reality to pivot from surveillance to control. With the augmented reality monument, the monument risks moving beyond a political imaginary and being instrumentalized as an agent of a new type of politics itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was absolutely fascinating. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. It is my pleasure to introduce the final speaker of this panel, Dr. Jonathan Vernon, who is an associate lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art. In 2020 to 2021, he was a Leonard A. Lauder postdoctoral fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. He was awarded his PhD by the Courtauld in 2019, and he was the Riding House contributing editor at the Burlington magazine from 2014 to 2017. His research has also been funded by the Terra Foundation for American Art and the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds. And his work has been published by Art History, Sculpture Journal and Tate, among others. Today, Jonathan will be contributing a paper titled Art After Oppenheimer, American Politics and the Many Deaths of Modernism. Thank you so much for being with us, Jonathan.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you to Louis and Madeline for what's been a wonderful conference so far. When I imagined the general drift of this paper last year, I did not think that its central theme, that of modernism's apocalyptic cast, would need to be discussed against the backdrop of nuclear escalation and a compromised Chernobyl. Equally, I didn't know that Hollywood was about to carve out a place for the cipher of this paper, the father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer, in its ideological edifice, with the Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer out next year. I suspect that the latter will be a useful measure of how the West is currently able to conceptualize the relationship between its love affair with technocratic power and the acts of real, if often distanced, displaced violence that it inflicts. Oppenheimer is the kind of historical figure that seems to allow for systemic violence to be contrasted with individual morality in such a way that maintains the possibility of redemption. You will all know the line that situates him in the Western moral imagination. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, a quotation of the Bhagavad Gita, supposedly recalled by Oppenheimer at the Trinity nuclear test site on 16th of July, 1945. The persistence of this anecdote is doubtless due in part to that particular strain of American morality that delights in the annexation of Eastern traditions. But it has more to do with the genuinely ambivalent moral figure that Oppenheimer became in the post-war era through his opposition to the development of thermonuclear weapons and his persecution by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Oppenheimer was a figure who helped to create and was created by the new forms of technocratic power that would consolidate the United States' position in global politics. But he was also a figure whose belonging to the nascent military-industrial complex was always couched in opposition to it, to the point of persuading President Eisenhower to famously sound a note of warning in his farewell address of 1961 about the possibility of, quote, unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex and the disastrous rise of misplaced power, end quote. So why start with Oppenheimer? One answer to this question comes from another interpretation of Oppenheimer's quotation from the Bhagavad Gita, for which we need to revisit the interview where he first elaborated it in full. He said that after the detonation of the device in 1945, we knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried, most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. What has been lost in the repetition of Oppenheimer's quotation is its emphasis on representation, on the inherent relationship between power and spectacle. The bomb was the United States in its multi-armed form, and much of Oppenheimer's subsequent role in public life involved disputing just how reliable this form could be in maintaining power and control on the world stage, and just how impressive it should be allowed to become. And this brings us to another answer to the question, why start with Oppenheimer? Modernism in this period has often been treated as one arm of the United States' terrible visage, both figuratively in the sense of Harold Rosenberg's apocalyptic wallpaper, and literally as in the scholarship of the 1970s and 1980s that identified abstract expressionism as a weapon of the Cold War. Of course, like Oppenheimer, post-war American modernism was in fact neither reducible to nor separable from its political, military, and industrial power. It belonged to and conflicted with its ideological apparatuses. But the question to be asked of modernism remains, as it was for much of the last century, a question of the precise nature of its belonging to a society capable of the violence inflicted on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Or to put it another way, what does it mean for modernism that the New York apartment in which Oppenheimer grew up was decorated by a collection of European furniture and modernist painting amassed by his father, the German textiles magnate Julius Oppenheimer? What does it mean that this Van Gogh, with its radiant sun sweeping across the land, remained in Oppenheimer's collection until the end of his life? What meanings and values could it have held for the scientist after what he had seen on the 16th of July, 1945? What could it possibly hold for us now? I think that we can start formulating new answers to these kinds of questions by studying how modernism was conceptualized in the critical moments at which it seemed to lose its salience, as a term, as a set of practices, as a means of seeing and understanding the world. In these moments, especially the late 1960s and again in the early 1980s, American artists were variously involved in self-consciously staging modernism's death, engaging in direct critique of its basic premises, and acting as though its death could simply be assumed. Critics and historians were on hand to interpret these acts, and in doing so repeat the rights over a body that could never quite be located. So what kind of historical event was being dramatized here? What I want to suggest is that we can gain a fuller understanding of what was supposed to have died with modernism by reading the performances of its death in terms of conceptualizations of American power and identity, the nation's horizons of political possibility, and in particular, the self-image of the United States constructed by a new class of intellectuals like Oppenheimer, who found themselves in a position of unprecedented power in the years after 1945. So our scope is wide, and I can't do much more here than indicate what this terrain looks like, and to put the argument for the granular treatment that we really need. In a 1950 monograph on Van Gogh, Maya Shapiro described Oppenheimer's picture as, quote, "a landscape with two centers. The first is indicated by the violet furrows converging hurriedly to a point behind the dark trees at the left horizon. The second is the great sun at the right. In this rivalry of centers, we feel some relation to human conflict, a tension between the self and its goals," end quote. This is hardly Shapiro at his most penetrating, but it's difficult to argue with his main thrust. Landscape with rising sun exists in time, and we know this because of its duality, its difference, its dialectical structure. It marks out a space, a world in which change, if only in the form of a deepening sense of contradiction, is possible. Painting that situated itself at the end of modernism had a complicated relationship with time, but one of its signatures was an attempt to compress space, and with it, bring the kind of time seen in landscape with rising sun to a halt. But this was not the paradigmatic Greenbergian flatness of abstract expressionism, which had always in practice meant a shallow space that might include infinity, at once incorporating the open skies and vast landscapes of the frontier and the sublime space of the Kantian subject. The practices of artists like Ad Reinhardt and Robert Ryman were rather a literalization of Greenberg. They seemed to ask what it would be like for a painting to be reducible to the mere materiality of canvas, paint, and stretcher. And in doing so, they smothered the exact type of temporality identified by Shapiro. Time was equally critical as a condition of the perceived end of modern sculpture, of American minimalism. It is well established that Robert Morris's notes on sculpture began life as a parody of Greenberg, a parody that ultimately repaired a rupture in the critic's application of his own doctrine. Modern sculpture had not become more optical, closer to the condition of painting, as Greenberg had claimed. Rather, Morris said, it had become more real, more tactile, more like an object in physical space. And as such an object, the experience of viewing it unfolded in real space and time. What had occurred in this moment was that the art object had begun to desert the symbolic space it once occupied, and with it its complicity in the kinds of ideological production that seemed to implicate modernism by the time of the 1960s. By moving across this threshold into the space of the real, the artist was not attempting to contain or stop time, but rather to exchange the confected narrative and thus ideological time and space of the art object for the time and space through which we all move, one in which real change and thus real critique were possible. For Benjamin Buchloh in 1983, this shift was epitomized in the work of Michael Asher, and especially in the work George Washington, which for our purposes here might speak back to that wonderful slide that concluded Richard Meyer's presentation yesterday. For this installation, Asher's contribution to the 73rd American exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1979, Asher relocated the bronze cast of Jean-Antoine Houdon's marble sculpture of George Washington that stood outside the museum's main entrance to an 18th century period room inside. Through this gesture, Asher performed a literal transposition of the object from the visual regime formed by the museum's neo-Renaissance facade and the symbolic space and time occupied by the public monument, which was, of course, the space and time of national mythology and ideology, to a historicized institutional environment in which it should, but palpably cannot, belong. He disclosed not only the sculpture's thingness, its contingency as an object that could be curated like any other, but also its textuality, its politics. Presented as such, the movement beyond modernism makes for a clean, compelling historical narrative. But as the juxtaposition of these examples from over a decade apart illustrate, it depends upon a reading of what was happening in the 1960s through the lens of the 1980s, and especially that decade's critical struggles to maintain a coherent, properly dialectical view of cultural production within the terms set out by postmodernist theory. What critiques like Buchlo's needed was a singular figure to stand for modernism, an antithesis, something to resist and negate. And this is precisely what Greenbergianism became. But there have been consequences for this. Certainly, an overvaluation of the possibility and effectiveness of the practice of post-minimal art, but also the oversimplistic assumption that modernism up to the 1960s could really be defined by its certainty, by sheer conviction in its own historical necessity, guaranteed by the support of an establishment who saw its own values reflected in modernist culture. The reality of art in the post-war era and that blurry, compromised point of transition to the period after 1968 is one perhaps defined by a complex and difficult negotiation with art world and broader institutional power. And these struggles were mirrored in the way that power came to be figured in American intellectual life as a whole. My recent research has sought to show this by revisiting the relationship between the aesthetic and political paradigms that emerged in the post-war era. In particular, I have wanted to complicate a history that takes the image of a confident, muscular liberalism projected by Arthur Schlesinger's concept of the vital center, steering a steady, performatively anti-ideological course between totalitarian extremes as the key that unlocks the American liberal imagination. In doing so, I have pointed to the eclipsed legacy of the political scientist Lewis Hartz, who believed that the American obsession with its founding fathers and founding documents, a condition of its fragmentation and isolation from the old world of European politics and the possibility of dialectical transformation that came with it, could only drive it to a state of ideological torpor and ultimately violent nationalism. This is to say that American national identity in the post-war era was, like its modernism, hardly certain of its new vertiginous place in time and in the world, and that this was perhaps most clear in the newly powerful intellectual class comprised of figures like Schlesinger, Hartz, and Oppenheimer. What did the expression of that sort of power look like? And what kind of critique was available in that interval between the historical moments circumscribed by minimalism on the one hand and Michael Asher on the other? In 1968, the artist and art historian Jack Burnham declared another end for modern sculpture. With his article System Aesthetics, published in Art Forum that September, and his book Beyond Modern Sculpture, The Effects of Science and Technology on the Art of this Century, Burnham set out a version of the medium's history that could only be read as a death sentence. That history was organized according to the development of technical processes. It was, as Burnham put it, a history in which, quote, change emanates not from things, but from the way things are done, end quote. This situated him in opposition to Greenberg in the same way that Semper had been opposed to Riegel, countering an idealist vision of history premised on a belief in imminent progress, with a materialism in which art's logic was dictated by the economic, social, and technological worlds to which it belonged. Where that logic pointed now was away from the discrete, autonomous object towards an art that reproduced systems of social organization, especially cybernetics, the science of communication. Burnham argued that the bodies of modern sculpture since the late 19th century had, through the abandonment of the pedestal and the incorporation of ephemeral everyday materials, become increasingly real, closer to lived experience. Now, through cybernetics, these bodies were beginning to answer back, whether in the absurd form of Robert Breer's motorized floats with their limited impression of social behavior, in the fragile, tragic form of Namjoon Paik's robot K456 spewing audio of a JFK speech and defecating peas, or, more compellingly from the perspective of the present, through human participants entered into a social matrix by the work of art, as in numerous installations that appeared in Software, Burnham's landmark exhibition of 1970. A wave of recent scholarship has understandably been enraptured by the prescience of Burnham's history in the age of digital art. Caroline A. Jones, for example, described reading Beyond Modern Sculpture as, quote, an exercise in reverse teleology, end quote. However, a sober assessment of what happened to Burnham's tech utopian dream, understood in the context of what information technology seemed to make politically and socially possible in the late 1960s, reveals a story of bitter disappointment and a profoundly compromised vision of the relationship between art and power after modernism. Burnham later reflected that as early as 1971, a period of political malaise set in, a malaise that in 1980 led him to describe systems theory as the panacea that failed. So what had happened? For one, major and exceptionally well-funded projects that applied the principles of systems aesthetics to contemporary art practice through collaborations between artists and engineers ended in failure. One was the Pepsi Pavilion at Expo 70 in Osaka, a creation of the Experiments in Art and Technology group. Its utilization of space-age technology for the production of a carefully choreographed, hallucinatory visitor experience was effective, but also effectively devoid of conceptual currency. The problem was as much about the EAT group's insistence that it was, quote, not interested in political and social comment, end quote, as it was about the project's sponsor. But the more decisive failure was the Los Angeles County Museum of Art's Art and Technology program, which installed artists within specific corporations over a 4-year period between 1967 and 1971. The products of these collaborations were an abject disappointment, broadly limited to larger scale, technically accomplished versions of works already conceived by the artists elsewhere. We might think of them as monumental. But worse, the report published at the project's conclusion, compiled by LACMA curator Maurice Tuchman, made clear that the integration of artistic production into the edifice of industrial production, and with it the dream of recapturing the social practice of constructivism in a digital age, in a capitalist age, was a fool's errand. John Chamberlain's exchange of memos with the employees at Rand Corporation, the think tank responsible for the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, was typical. Having sent out a memo to all staff simply reading, quote, I'm searching for answers, not questions, Chamberlain received replies that ranged from the perceptive, an artist in residence soothes the conscience of the management, to the apoplectic. Anyone who would send out a memo like this is a damned idiot wasting our time and money. What was shown by these examples, and the broader picture painted by Tuchman's reported visionaries wandering the empty corridors of the military-industrial complex, was that for art to become truly systemic, it was bound not only to become more dependent on institutional power than modernism had ever been, but to have whatever remaining capacity for critique it possessed utterly nullified. If modernism's relationship to post-war American ideology could be encapsulated by the Rand nuclear strategist Albert Wohlstetter's friendship with Le Corbusier, for example, or in a quite different way Oppenheimer's Van Gogh, it could never have been described as fully integrated with the military-industrial complex itself. As Jones points out, this problem made itself felt in the very first footnote of Burnham's article on systems aesthetics in 1968, which cites the 1964 Rand Corporation document Analysis for Military Decisions. In other words, systems aesthetics in a very real sense literalized modernism's relationship to power just as art from minimalism onward literalized Greenberg. The difference is that it did not see itself moving towards an end, but rather as a new beginning. The question of how we are to understand the blindness of systems art to its problematic positioning is key and moves us towards a conclusion. As part of his report on the art and technology programme, Tuchman conceded that few artists would have agreed to participate in the project had it begun in 1971. A caustic review by Max Kozloff explained exactly why. Quote, during the term of the project, there occurred the My Lai massacre, the Chicago Democratic Convention riots, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, the invasion of Cambodia, and the student killings at Kent and Jackson State. While these convulsions were taking place, inflaming the radicalism of our youth and polarizing the country, the American artists did not hesitate to freeload at the trough of that techno-fascism that had inspired. End quote. But it was not just that these events had changed what it meant to inaugurate a corporate avant-garde. Rather, it was that a political paradigm, another conception of the American liberal project, had lost its capacity to compel assent. What has been most set aside in recent commentary on Burnham has been his debt, outlined at some length in his work of 1968, to the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, and especially his 1967 book, The New Industrial State. Like Schlesinger before him, Galbraith was a pioneer of the middle road, this time between Marxist economics and laissez-faire capitalism. Once again, the dream was that of a world without ideology, without symbolic space, without founding fathers. But now the best way of securing that world was judged to be through submission to technocracy, to the apotheosis of the world that Oppenheimer had woken up to in 1945, with blood on his hands and a Van Gogh on his wall. What had ended up being unthinkable by 1971 was simply the latest attempt to describe a world that American power seemed capable of bringing about, and that its dominant ideology could live with. The art was just collateral. That's originally where I stopped, but upon rereading the paper this morning, I thought I really needed a conclusion to bring things back around. So if you'll permit me, I just have a few lines left. My aim here has not been to dismiss outright the terms on which Burnham saw art living on beyond modernism. In many ways, our contemporary art is systems art, in the sense that, in Burnham's words, it is about, quote, relations between people and the components of their environment. This is also what Buclow's Michael Asher is about, and Elizabeth Johnson's paper has just demonstrated this brilliantly. But this makes it all the more important to understand the terms of Burnham's failure. The failure, and I quote Burnham again, to, quote, reduce the technical and physical distance between the artist's output and the productive means of society. It's here that we might learn more about our own condition, never mind the condition of modernism. And it's here that a material, fully realized understanding of the dominant centrist ideology, the landscape and language of cultural power is most required. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for a fantastic paper, and thank you ever so much to Elizabeth. So we are starting the Q&A. Please do start posting your questions into the chat for our speakers. We have our first to kick us off. Louis asks Jonathan, I wondered what you think about how far the perception of modernism as cohesive or coherent by comparison with what came after is justified. Do you think American modernism can be regarded as an intact and cohesive cultural phenomenon? So that's the question.
No, not at all. I think one of the brilliant things that this conference has shown is that American, it doesn't even make sense to call it modernism in a way, 20th century visual culture in America is plural and differenced, and our scholarship has got to that point now. But my point is that so much of our view of, should we call it high modernism, mid-century modernism, was shaped in that moment in the 1980s, where it had to figure as a point of negation, where it did still hold establishment power, but it had to signify a certain set of things for the new critical paradigms that were emerging in the early years of postmodernism. So I hope that my paper didn't give that impression, and in fact, I sort of hope that dropping in both the atomic age modernism of abstract expressionism and of Van Gogh and everything else sort of illustrated the point that modernism, when taken as monolithic, can be made to stand for anything, and that's been one of its problems within the discourse, I think. So that's a very good question. I'm glad to answer it.
Alexandra has a question for Jonathan, which picks up on an earlier question. If there is not one modernism, there is equally not one postmodernism, but do they have in common the same institutional stranghold?
I'm sure I can pick this up with Alexandra later, because that is an impossibly large question. I mean, if these things are plural, then they have inherently different relationships to institutions, and which institutions are we talking about? I mean, on the one hand, there's been a decentralization of power in the postmodern era to very different kinds of institutions than there were in 1968, and art figures its relationship to them differently. I would be, this might actually segue quite nicely onto Tom's question as well. I think I found Elizabeth's paper fascinating because as a not very tech savvy person, and also like a pessimist, I think there's a default to be skeptical about the possibility of radical practice coming out of technologies that are fundamentally sort of overlaying another kind of perception onto physical spaces. But I thought you made a really compelling argument for the ways in which they could be. And I mean, you can, if you wanted to read Tom's question, please do. But I would love to hear from Elizabeth on, just more on how that separateness can be secured on a sort of the separateness of the technology and it being really used and applied in a different way on a community level. Like, I'd just like to hear more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's really important to say there's like never anything like, there's not some inherent badness about a particular type of technology or another. And I think that what is going to be really interesting for art historians particularly is the idea of a mode of visual culture which is happening in this very individualized way, which is in a way not going to happen externally to your awareness of perception. So I think it's really, if these wearable things do happen in the way that they're being predicted that they will, I think it's a massive challenge that we'll have to completely reconfigure the way we engage with our visual culture. And yeah, there's something really, to me, sort of fallible or flawed in this idea of I'm going to make a political statement, but I'm only going to make a political statement to the people who want to hear it and agree with it. That it is this type of art that exists like within a filter bubble, more so than any other. I know you have to choose to go into a museum, but this feels like quite a different sort of thing. But what I really enjoyed about your paper, Jonathan, in terms of thinking about my own, was really thinking about what's going on with these augmented reality artworks in relation to minimalism and in relation to this kind of interest in like a phenomenological space and experience, and what happens when the phenomenological experience remains. So you're still working with these things in the round, but actually the object is removed.
Yeah, thank you, Alice, for sharing. Brilliant job. So yeah, we'll have just under 20 minutes and we'll be back at around 3:40 GMT for the next panel. See you then.
Okay, welcome back everybody. I hope you've all got tea or coffee in hand. I'm going to hand straight over now to Francesca Wilmot, who is chairing our second panel today. Francesca Wilmot is a PhD candidate at the Courtauld Institute of Art, supervised by Professor Joe Applin. She formerly served as curatorial assistant at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and as associate curator at the Jan Schremm and Maria Monetti Schremm Museum of Art at the University of California in Davis. Her doctoral research examines artists working in Northern California in the 1960s and 1970s. She recently contributed texts on Imogen Cunningham and Judy Data to A World History of Women Photographers, which will be published by Thames and Hudson in fall 2022. Thank you so much for being with us, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Maddie, for your kind introduction, and also to both you and Louis for organizing such a thought-provoking symposium these past few days. And I'm so pleased to be able to join today from California to help chair our fourth and final panel, which is entitled Performance and Spectacle. So I'm delighted to now introduce our first speaker. Wendy Bellion is Professor of Art History and the Sewell C. Biggs Chair in American Art at the University of Delaware, where she also serves as Director of the Center for Material Culture Studies. Her research focuses on 18th and 19th century art in North America and the Atlantic world. She is the author of Iconoclasm in New York, Revolution to Reenactment, published by Penn State University Press in 2019, and Citizen Spectator, Art, Illusion, and Visual Perception in Early National America, which was published by OIEAH and UNC Press in 2011. And this book was awarded the Charles Eldridge Prize by the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Professor Bellion also served as co-editor of Objects in Motion, Art and Material Culture Across Colonial North America, which Winter Third Portfolio published in 2011. And she's currently co-editing a volume called Things Change, about 18th century material cultures, which Bloomsbury Academic will publish in 2023. And she's researching for pictures on stage, art and theater in the early United States, which sounds truly fascinating. So I'll now hand over the floor to Wendy, who will deliver what promises to be a really thought-provoking paper entitled Iconoclasm, Redux, Public Space, and National Identity.
Thank you so much, Francesca, and good afternoon to those of you in the UK, good morning to those of you in the US, and my thanks to Louis and Maddie for inviting me to be a part of this fabulous symposium. Let me go ahead and share my screen. My talk today will draw from the book that Francesca just mentioned, called Iconoclasm in New York, which examined the material life and afterlives of a Revolutionary era monument in New York City. And I should begin by noting that I've had the opportunity and the pleasure of presenting aspects of this project before for Courtauld events, so my apologies in advance if some of this rings familiar. My paper today, however, addresses the question of performance and spectacle that organizes this particular panel, especially how the re-performance or the reenactment of an act of a political iconoclasm during the 18th century may be understood to inform the political interests, both local and national, of the early 20th century, in particular, early 20th century New York City. The act of iconoclasm in question concerned this gilded lead equestrian statue of King George III that stood in Bowling Green, a small park at the very tip of Manhattan, and which you see here in a 20th century depiction. In 1766, the Colonial Assembly of New York commissioned this statue from a London sculptor named Joseph Wilton, and the point was to honor the king's support for the repeal of the Stamp Act, which was the first of the parliamentary taxes to excite widespread protest in North America. Wilton designed the statue of George III after the well-known classical sculpture of Marcus Aurelius on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. It arrived in Manhattan in the year 1770, together with a marble figure of William Pitt the Elder that Wilton had also modeled, and Pitt had been a famous champion of colonial rights during the Stamp Act crisis of the 1760s. The Pitt statue was installed at the corner of William and Wall Streets in the heart of today's financial district. And as you can see, it no longer has its head or its arms, which were lost to unknown attackers during the Revolutionary War. The Equestrian Statue was raised a few blocks away on a large pedestal at Bowling Green. And there it stood, at least until July 9th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was read aloud to American troops uptown at a public ground called the Common, which you can also see on this map. Impassioned by the Declaration's indictment of the British King, a crowd gathered that evening in Bowling Green and pulled down the statue. This dramatic event would inspire the creation of more than a dozen 18th and 19th century paintings and prints that reimagined this scene. It also inspired a number of 20th century reenactments in the form of civic pageants and tableau vivants, including the one that I'll be discussing today. The Hudson Fulton celebration of 1909, which featured a historical parade with floats representing episodes from New York's past. One of them included a model of the Equestrian Statue with actors in colonial costume. Collectively, this body of pictures and performances do a number of things. For example, they evacuate iconoclasm of its political and material violence, rendering social conflict palatable for visual consumption. They also present what the art historian Erica Nijinsky, writing about French revolutionary scenes of destruction, has called, quote, an exegesis on negation that is paradoxically visual in nature. Indeed, as Nijinsky has asked, how does the representation of destruction work exactly? I'd like to put a version of that question to the Hudson Fulton to explore how the reenactment of iconoclasm worked within the political culture of the Colonial Revival, the phenomenon that formed the context for this event, as well as the temporal structure of the parade itself. In fact, it's more accurate to describe this float as a representation of non-destruction, because instead of rehearsing iconoclasm, it problematically returned a sculptural figure of a lost British king to a place that had been independent of a monarchy for some 125 years. So I'd like to speak to how the resurrection of a statue of George III served the ideological interests of the parade's conservative organizers, and also how the parade itself exposed the temporal fictions that reenactment as a performance proposed to elide. So to appreciate how this float at once collapsed and remade historical time, we need first to return to revolutionary New York. From the Commons, where colonial New Yorkers had erected a series of liberty poles in celebration of their rights as British subjects, it was 1 mile downhill along Broadway to the Equestrian Statue at Bowling Green. The British commanded the southern tip of the island, and the royalist character of the neighborhood made Bowling Green a logical start point and end point for civic ceremonies and civil protests. In 1765, for example, a crowd angered by the Stamp Act paraded south from the Commons to protest the tax. Setting out from the Liberty Pole, and here you're seeing a 20th century depiction of what it might have looked like, a group of rioters arrived at Fort George with effigies of the devil and the despised lieutenant governor. At Bowling Green, they demolished the governor's carriage. They built a massive bonfire and they fed it with the effigies. And this is a pretty complicated image. It's a study for another float at the Hudson Fulton, and I'd be happy to speak to it in more detail later. Bowling Green was thus a vexed political space well before the statue of the king went up on its pedestal in 1770 and came down just 6 years later in 1776. The presence of the statue ensured that it would continue to be contested. Regally towering atop its pedestal, the sculpture put a face on the British Empire, remaking Bowling Green into a place for imperial display. Years before it was toppled then, the statue formed part of an urban culture of political performance. This is equally true of the statue's destruction. Although we don't know what fully happened on the night in July of 1776 when the crowd assembled at Bowling Green, it's clear that iconoclasm reanimated an urban space that had already been charged by local ritual. Armed with ladders, ropes, and axes, the crowd scaled the pedestal, toppled the horse, and beheaded the figure of the king. American troops conveyed most of the lead out of which the statue was made to a military depot in Litchfield, Connecticut, where it was melted down and recast as bullets for use by the American Army. Along the way, loyalists to the king in the town of Wilton got a hold of several fragments and hid them underground. All that remained in Bowling Green after 1776 were a few shards of lead and the pedestal of Wilton's statue, which some New Yorkers reimagined as a memorial to the Revolution, and it would stay there for another 40 years. In the meantime, others would propose repopulating it with statues honoring the new George in power, namely George Washington, whose name has curiously come up a number of times across the past 2 days. At the same time, the king's statue began to enjoy an afterlife in the form of fragments that began resurfacing in Connecticut and finding their way back into New York City collections, but also in 19th century works of art that revisited this act of destruction. This painting by Johannes Fertel, a German artist who was displaced by the 1848 revolutions across Europe, became the basis for many prints in the 19th century. And also within the past 2 years, which have seen many further acts of iconoclasm and the removal of statues, many social media posts on Instagram and elsewhere. By the end of the 19th century, reenactors were also staging civic performances that celebrated the demise of the royal statue as the birth of an independent America. The most ambitious of these reenactments happened at the Hudson Fulton celebration. Now, as the name suggests, this event marked the 300th anniversary of the arrival of the explorer Henry Hudson in Manhattan, but also the centennial of the invention of the steamboat by an American named Robert Fulton and its passage along the Hudson River from Manhattan to Albany. The Hudson Fulton was the largest civic party that New York had ever thrown. It featured 2 weeks of speeches, concerts, and exhibitions throughout the city and the state capital of Albany. And one of the highlights was the historical parade, a day-long event that meandered over 100 city blocks and featured floats that organizers called, quote, moving models and living tableaus. And here's a photograph representing just one of those floats of Bowling Green, which appeared several times throughout the parade, but this time as a Dutch colonial space, complete with a windmill, as you can see, and reenactors literally bowling on the space of the green. The parade organizers used a very rich lexicon to describe these floats. They called them scenes and pictures, and they arranged them in a sequential structure that they called a visual unfolding. The historical and performative nature of the parade lent itself to this idea of unfolding. The parade was linear in a temporal sense because the floats were at least meant to follow a chronological logic, but it was also spatially linear. The procession moved north to south through the city's urban grid, snaking from the Upper West Side to Washington Square Park. The parade's idea of scenes or tableaus go to the heart of how reenactment works. And here you see a postcard and a pamphlet literally representing these floats, or this one float, as a kind of pictorial scene. By 1909, Tableau Vivants had become popular features of civic festivals. Costume performers enacted the roles of figures from canonical paintings, sculptures, literature, and historical events, often with the intent of conjuring up something familiar. Notably, Tableau Vivants were meant to be still, and in this regard, the Hudson Fulton tableaus might be described as stagings rather than as reenactments, with the sense of motion that that term implies. In other words, they operated on a logic of immobility, of stillness rather than action. And this helps to explain a few things about the float of the Bowling Green statue. Although all of the descriptive texts narrated an act of destruction, nothing appears to have actually been destroyed. Photographs show a group of costumed men standing around the base of a reproduction statue that represents some imaginary version of the lost original. We can make out ropes around the statue held by several men, and the fence around the pedestal has been constructed to look bent, as if trampled. But the statue itself remains undamaged. By contrast, in the corresponding postcard of the float, the statue is already leaning over, as if coming down. Unlike the photograph, then, the image on the postcard predicts a destruction that is already and always in process. Notably, this is precisely the moment of suspended animation that appears in many 19th century images of Bowling Green, including Hertel's. Tableau Vivant catalogs offered another resource to the designer of this float. In this example, the destruction of the king statue features prominently, although very small on the lower left corner. And as in the postcard, the statue is under assault, but not yet pulled over. One conclusion that we can draw from this succession of images, and there are many others, is that the Hudson Fulton float was as much a response to a century of visual representations about iconoclasm as it was any kind of reenactment of 1776. In other words, the history that the float conveyed through New York was as much an art history, an aggregate of images over time, as it was a political or civic history. Still, it's worth observing that what the float presented was not destruction, but rather a failure to destruct. Now, maybe the costume performers tore the statue down at the end of the parade, and no photographer was on hand to snap a picture. But for the long duration of the parade through the city streets, what spectators witnessed was neither iconoclasm nor its aftermath, but rather its before, not destruction, but the performance that parade organizers called a visual unfolding. In retrospect, we might consider this as a problem of temporality. Not only was there a disjuncture in what the floats purported to represent, they also inadvertently confounded the linearity of historical time. Each float was supposed to follow a chronological sequence. The statue's destruction in 1776 was meant to follow a float representing 1775, and then precede one representing the following year, 1777. But this is not what happened. Instead, many of the floats became disordered. For example, a colonial house followed the statue when it was meant to appear earlier, a mistake that was chronicled in the photograph that you see in the lower right. The performance theorist Rebecca Schneider has encouraged a productive understanding of such disorderings, arguing, and I quote, that any time-based art encounters its most interesting aspect in the fold, the double, the second, the clone, the uncanny, the againness of reenactment, close quote. And in fact, it is sometimes the very inadequacy of the reproduction that is most telling. In a historical parade out of sequence, or a statue that defies its own destruction, and again I quote Schneider, time plays forward and backward and sideways across the imagined community of an otherwise spatialized national plot. What, Schneider then poses, does time drag through such structures of reenactment? These points bear special consideration within the parade, for this was a period in which privileged white Americans, like the organizers of the Hudson Fulton, were trying to draw a very particular vision of the past forward in the interests of the political present. In other words, this was the Colonial Revival, a wave of conservative nostalgia lasting some 50 years that witnessed the reproduction of colonial era objects and the reification of Anglo and Anglo-American culture. This was the same era that generated so many of the Confederate monuments to white supremacy that communities across the United States have been removing over the past 2 years. The Colonial Revival saw the rise of numerous patriotic societies that identified themselves as guardians of historical culture against a host of perceived threats, from industrialization and commercialization to the growth of immigration and the laboring classes. Members of the Colonial Revival sponsored new institutions like museums and historical societies, and they sought to promote what historian David Glassberg has vividly called, quote, the vitality and picturesqueness of their own Anglo-American Protestant history and customs. The Hudson Fulton celebration fell squarely within these ambitions. And in light of this context, it's worth considering what the float of the King statue achieved, as well as what it failed to realize, that is, destruction. Why did Americans resurrect a statue of George III in 1909, only to imply that they would pull it down again? Well, for one, the float reproduced the idea of iconoclasm as a starting point for American independence, as an origin story, in other words, of nationhood itself. Iconoclasm could literally be figured as a tipping point, marking New York's entree into the revolution and the city's patriotism. But another way of answering what the Hudson Fulton float accomplished is to underscore that, in fact, that model of George III did remain standing. Despite the promise of destruction, an iconic figure of British colonialism stayed intact and visible on city streets. And we have to consider how this non-destruction signified within an early 20th century culture anxious about demographic change and the growing racial and ethnic diversity of New York City. Literary historians have emphasized the persistent Englishness of the post-revolutionary United States. In many ways, white Americans continued to model their culture on British practices and values. The reappearance of the royal statue into the 20th century invites us to consider a much longer trajectory of Anglophilia. By pulling the statue down, both actually in 1776 and imaginatively in later decades, Americans could mark their political independence from Britain. But by bringing it back, they also reified hegemonies of class, race, and ethnicity. The Hudson Fulton float thereby participated in a reiterative cycle of representation that had been ongoing since a crowd of British Americans toppled the royal statue in 1776. Iconoclasm, whether actual or reimagined, was a mobilizing force in this process because it entailed continual reinvention as well as destruction. An out with the old and an in with the new. Moreover, its reiteration presupposed a destruction that was always already underway. In visual and performative depictions, the statue was forever falling and returning, defying any kind of temporal fixation. This process did not stop in 1909. In fact, the Hudson Fulton accelerated the pace of depictions and reenactments, even inspiring some New Yorkers to propose a new monument for George III at Bowling Green in 1909 and 1910. One patriotic society, the Daughters of the American Revolution, quickly panned this idea, citing, quote, the unpleasant incidents that our new royal statue might incite. More appropriate, one of their members suggested, was a counter monument, namely, and I quote, a replica in bronze of the group made for the Hudson Fulton celebration of pulling down the original statue. This novel suggestion would have produced a veritable mise en abîme of iconoclasm. Another individual was more sympathetic to the idea of a new George III statue, suggesting in a letter to the New York Times that there was, quote, no reason why we should forget that this country was once a colony, unquote. In the end, Bowling Green did not get another statue of George III, but performances about its destruction continued to appear at signal moments in 20th century political history, including a society ball held at the Waldorf Astoria to honor George Washington's birthday, a reenactment in 1935 of the melting of the statue's parts in the town where the monument had been transported in 1776 to make bullets for the army, and a bicentennial parade in 1976 in the town of Wilton, Connecticut, where loyalists had buried and concealed fragments of the statue 200 years earlier. I'm happy to say more about all of those, but I want to conclude by quickly mentioning how I ended my book and what its post-history has been. So the continuing reappearance and erasure of the Bowling Green statue in the national imaginary led me to end that book with a question: where would the statue of George III turn up next? And it turns out I did not have to wait very long for an answer. This past January, a new exhibition opened at the New York Historical Society that prominently featured the narrative of the statue's destruction. The exhibition is titled Monuments, Commemoration, and Controversy, and it explores the past and present roles of public statues in American political life, from Bowling Green to an unrealized sculpture of Sojourner Truth to a 1939 World's Fair commission celebrating Black music. The narrative of the King's statue, plus a canonical fragment from it, a part of the horse's tail, which you see at left, and even a small-scale model reimagining the original monument all form part of the exhibition. But what's really interesting is what occupies the very center of this small gallery. The exhibition also features an interactive element that invites visitors to imagine new monuments for a mock Bowling Green pedestal. The goal is to encourage people to consider tributes to people historically underrepresented in commemorative imagery. And of course, my mind immediately returned to that earlier moment when patriotic societies sparred over whether to raise a new statue to George III or to a monument commemorating iconoclasm. Visitors to the exhibition have responded enthusiastically to this prompt, as you can see by the sticky notes that cover the top of this mock pedestal. And if you look closely, you can see a lot of suggestions that range from the silly, such as a monument to Ron Weasley, to the potentially spurious, Leonardo DiCaprio, to the serious, as in Ruth Bader Ginsburg. If I were a fortune teller, I'd predict that we are not done yet with George III in Bowling Green. In just 4 years, in 2026, the US will mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. In other words, its national birthday. And with this commemoration in view, and within the context of ongoing contestations over public space, I anticipate that the King statue is simply going to continue informing ongoing national dialogues about both the promises and the problems of public monuments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for your illuminating paper. And I look forward to discussing what I'm sure are many questions during our question and answer period. And just a reminder for the audience, if you have any questions that come to mind while the speakers are presenting, feel free to just pop those into the chat box and we'll get to those at the end of all 3 papers. So now I'm going to turn to our next speaker, Professor Catherine Wells. Kay Wells is Associate Professor of American Art and Architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where her research focuses on the politics of decorative art and design. She's the author of Weaving Modernism, Post-War Tapestry Between Paris and New York, published by Yale in 2019, which won the 2020 CCAC Award for Excellence in Scholarly Research and Publication. She is also published in American Art, the Archives of American Art Journal, and Art Journal. And she's received funding from the Terra Foundation, the New York Public Library, the Winterthur Museum, and the Passhold Research Fund, among others. Her talk today is part of her current book project, Uncanny Revivals, Designing Early America During the Rise of Fascism. And so now I'd like to welcome Kay.
Thank you so much, Francesca. And thank you so much to the organizers for including me in this really wonderful lineup of speakers. I'm gonna see if, okay, so during the 1930s and 1940s, two very different yet very popular projects used the aesthetic experience of design to reshape ideologies of whiteness and American political identity. As part of President Roosevelt's New Deal, the Federal Art Project sponsored the Index of American Design, employing hundreds of artists to produce thousands of meticulous watercolors that recorded early American decorative arts in strikingly mimetic detail. And you can see a worker making one of those watercolors on the right. Meanwhile, John D. Rockefeller Jr. funded Colonial Williamsburg, the monumental reconstruction of the town of Williamsburg, Virginia, to its appearance during the 18th century. Despite the differences in format between flat two-dimensional drawings and an immersive three-dimensional environment, both projects created an uncanny aesthetic experience that seemed to literally bring the past back to life and that empowered viewers to learn about America through apparently direct contact with history itself. These projects traded on viewers' familiarity with the domestic environment to achieve their uncanny effects, representing everyday objects and spaces to help viewers feel themselves to be within the past. This feeling of history through bodily senses furthered these projects' claims to authenticity and their naturalization of white nationalist ideologies. For both projects also forged new alliances between different groups of white Americans. Colonial Williamsburg unified Northerners and Southerners around a romanticized depiction of the antebellum Cavalier South, emphasizing the South's contributions to the American Revolution and reincorporating the South back into national history after the Civil War. The Index of American Design helped reconcile recent European immigrants with so-called old stock Americans by presenting Euro-Americans not as separate races, but as regional ethnicities that lent desirable diversity to a unified white or so-called Caucasian race, as well as a unified American art. So by comparing the Index of American Design with Colonial Williamsburg, my talk today will show how the aesthetic experience of early American design helped unify national political identity around changing conceptions of whiteness. And so really what I'm interested in here is how these projects empowered new groups of Americans to imagine themselves as part of American history and therefore as, part of American national identity by virtue of their whiteness. And building on the definition of colonial revivalism that Wendy provided in her talk, part of what I hope to show with this book project is how in this slightly later period, colonial revivalism is effective precisely because it expands beyond this, the reification of this kind of narrow Anglo Northeast, elite cultural heritage, and empowers new types of white Americans to feel like they're part of this colonial history. So the builders of Colonial Williamsburg referred to their endeavor as the Restoration with a capital R. And like the restoration of a deposed monarch, their project celebrated the pomp and circumstance of a bygone era by emphasizing, or arguably inventing, the aristocratic quality of 18th century Williamsburg. This celebration of the aristocratic Old South was a huge part of Colonial Williamsburg's appeal when it opened to visitors. In 1933, H.I. Brock wrote a lengthy article for the New York Times Magazine about the aristocratic glamour of the site, comparing it favorably with Versailles and claiming that, quote, the restorers have captured, not created, a mood characteristic of the 18th century connoisseur, marked by, quote, an elegance and old world dignity of modest pretension combined with a certain arrogance born of assured mastery of good taste. Brock closely associated this opulence with the old world or Europe, highlighting the whiteness of its participants. And he claimed, quote, like any European capital, Williamsburg has her palace again, where were held audiences, balls, and illuminations on the great occasions, such as royal coronations and birthdays. And he further insisted that, quote, the sense of being transported to another age is so complete that even the brand newness of the copy cannot disperse the atmosphere of right antiquity, the unmistakable old-fashioned air, end quote. This idealization of 18th century Williamsburg as a time of aristocratic ladies and brave cavaliers was part of a larger lost cause ideology. The term lost cause refers to Southern interpretations of the Civil War that justified the Confederate succession and defeat by denying that slavery was the primary cause of the conflict. Central to this ideology was the characterization of Southerners as so-called cavaliers, a class of gallant military heroes who defended their beautiful Southern belles and loyal enslaved servants from Northern aggression, but who had also created a superior Southern culture full of gracious living on charming plantations. Alan Nolan has shown how the lost causes promotion of the so-called Cavalier South drew on notions of racial difference between Northerners and Southerners that supposedly dated to the Norman conquest of England. As articulated in an anonymous 1860 essay on the difference of race between Northern and Southern people in Southern Literary Messenger, Northerners were descended from the English Puritans of Anglo-Saxon origin. Southerners, by contrast, were descended from, quote, that stock recognized as Cavaliers, who had been royalists under Charles I, and who traced their origin to, quote, the Norman barons of William the Conqueror, a race distinguished in its earliest history for its warlike and fearless character, a race in all time since renowned for its gallantry, its chivalry, its honor, its gentleness, and its intellect, end quote. So although this racial distinction between Northerners and Southerners written on the eve of the Civil War might seem like it would have been hopelessly outdated by the time Colonial Williamsburg was being built, these ideas continued to circulate during at least the 1930s. When the reconstructed Capitol building opened in Colonial Williamsburg in 1934, Virginia State Senate and House of Delegates held a special joint session there to celebrate the restoration. Williamsburg's state delegate, Ashton Dovell, gave an address that rehearsed many of the same themes as the anonymous 1860 author. As in New England, the Pilgrim colony grew apace, Dovell said, so in Virginia prospered that of the Cavaliers. And, quote, with that love of landed estates, which is an instinct of our race, they, quote, built great houses upon broad acres. Dovell described how a, quote, certain baronial air pervaded these estates, where, quote, household drudgeries were separated from the main dwelling, and, quote, the family became a considerable government within itself, the mistress, a rural queen, the master, a local potentate, with his graziers, seedsmen, gardeners, brewers, butchers, and cooks around him, end quote. So clearly the proliferation of enslaved workers performing their household drudgeries in spaces separated from their white enslavers was essential to Dovell's vision of Virginia's aristocratic past. This positioning of Southerners as a race of so-called Cavaliers might seem to further separate the South from the North, but Dovell's celebratory address and the larger Colonial Williamsburg project that it promoted glorified the Cavalier South in order to justify its Confederate history and its Jim Crow present as necessary, even desirable chapters of larger national narratives. Moreover, white visitors from the North and across the United States were encouraged to identify as Cavaliers or their ladies as they walked the streets and gardens of Colonial Williamsburg and experienced its atmosphere. This promotion of colonial Cavaliers thus reunited Northerners and Southerners around a shared identification with whiteness. Costumed interpreters and official photographs of them within Colonial Williamsburg supported this aristocratic vision of the past by articulating clearly racialized hierarchies. In one of its earliest photo books called Williamsburg, Virginia, A Brief Study in Photographs, Colonial Williamsburg argued through words and images that, quote, the simple magnificence of so small a city was and is indicative of the opulence and culture which pervaded the Virginia colony, end quote. A photograph here of white women being served tea by a Black man is captioned to emphasize the authenticity of the scene. Quote, accurately costumed hostesses and attendants interpret and maintain the exhibition buildings. The palace parlor is furnished in keeping with the inventories of colonial occupants, end quote. One of the most popular attractions at Colonial Williamsburg was the presence of a Black woman, often referred to as, quote, Mammy, who interpreted the kitchen of the governor's palace. She is pictured here, but with a caption that emphasizes not the labor of the enslaved kitchen workers she represents, but the opulence of the era and the absent white governor. And I'm quoting the caption, "Royal governors complained that the demands of Virginia hospitality impoverished them. On occasion, meals for 200 guests were prepared in the outside kitchen and carried to the palace in covered dishes." End quote. Visitor accounts of Colonial Williamsburg make clear that the presence of these costumed interpreters, both white and Black, was crucial for creating the illusion of history brought back to life. And I'm showing you some more images here from an article in the National Geographic in 1937. One visitor, for example, described, quote, "When I went into the governor's palace and found 3 charming ladies sitting about a blazing fire, I felt I had stepped across the threshold into the past and looked with surprise at my own incongruous tweeds, thinking the same wand must have transformed them. It was all so real," the visitor went on, mentioning, quote, "the old mammy, the gardens, every detail so perfect," end quote. Another visitor similarly described the transporting experience of Colonial Williamsburg, where, quote, "we feel that we are in a strange place. To complete our amazement, a coach appears, drawn by 2 gray horses with a Negro coachman and footman, both wearing brown knee breeches, green coats, cream-colored waistcoats, and white ruffled shirts. The coach stops before one of the white houses with dormer windows. The door opens and out comes a young woman in a pink and white dress with hoop skirts and a fichu, and on her head a white cap. This is too much for us, and we turn to our friend from Richmond and ask if she sees what we see. Is it the ghost of Martha Washington, who often visited Williamsburg?" And what I want to point out is that in both of these accounts, the presence of the, quote, mammy or, quote, Negro coachman, particularly in contrast with charming ladies or the ghost of Martha Washington, gave these visitors the sense that Colonial Williamsburg had recreated a complete historical society, a total immersive environment. Yet Colonial Williamsburg invited viewers to not just see the racial hierarchies of the past, but to feel them as embodied subjects within that historical setting. Viewers of Colonial Williamsburg imagined themselves to be experiencing a lived historical reality that appeared authentic through its construction of racial hierarchies. Indeed, these views felt natural in part because they reinforced inequalities that 1930s Americans were used to. Photographs such as these and Colonial Williamsburg more generally legitimize such inequalities as historically long-standing and naturalize them as conventional norms. In a more glaring example, one of the images that you see here on the bottom left is captioned, quote, "There is one custom that time has not changed. Forebears of the pickaninnies who are up to their ears in watermelon probably received a similar treat from the soldiers of the revolution," end quote. So here the past is brought back to life in order to sanction the inequalities of the present. In its own effort to bring the past back to life, the Index of American Design was unique among WPA federal art projects, which, as we heard a little bit about in Richard's talk yesterday, normally showcased contemporary art. The index, however, which operated from 1935 to 1942 in 35 states, ventured to create a comprehensive survey of American decorative arts and design before 1900, employing as many as 500 artists at a time to produce over 18,000 meticulously hand-drawn watercolor illustrations that each document a single object. The index excluded most work made by Native, African, and Asian Americans, but its organizers especially sought out items produced by relatively isolated or archaic groups, such as the Pennsylvania Germans, the Jansenists of the Bishop Hill Colony in Illinois, and the Zouaris of Ohio. The index singled out these cultural groups in press releases that were parroted in local newspapers and in separate sections of the numerous popular exhibits held in museums, department stores, and federal art galleries that were seen by millions of people across the country. And you see one of these exhibitions here from Macy's. These groups that the index singled out could be safely understood as creators of what was just becoming codified at that time as folk art, in large part because they were European immigrants who were linked to the considerably more renowned folk art of European peasants. The organizers and promoters of the index argued that these European forms had been simplified, democratized, and otherwise transformed by the American environment, resulting in a so-called native art that was both aesthetically varied and uniformly rooted in European origins. By constructing American art as both pleasingly diverse and consistently linked to a European past, the Index of American Design aligned perfectly with the changing conception of whiteness that marked the second quarter of the 20th century. In the wake of the 1924 Immigration Act, which imposed national immigration quotas and considerably lowered xenophobic anxieties about invading hordes of undesirable European groups, Americans increasingly understood whiteness less as a set of separate European races, such as so-called Teutons, Celts, and Alpines, or even as we saw with the discussion of Williamsburg, Puritans and Cavaliers, and more as an array of ethnicities, a term that would not actually be coined until the 1940s, that lent desirable cultural diversity to a unified white or so-called Caucasian race. By celebrating the diversity of white Euro-Americans and presenting their material culture as the basis for unified American art, the Index of American Design supported this shift in the definition of whiteness and its underpinning of American national identity. One example of this whitewashing is the Shakers, which the index quickly singled out for special recognition. While a small number of collectors and modern artists in the Northeast had already begun celebrating Shaker design as an American origin for modernism, index exhibitions made the Shakers eminently more visible as, quote, the first functionalists, whose design was, quote, astonishingly modern in its simplicity. And I'm sure we're all kind of familiar with that reception story of Shaker design. However, index publications and exhibition reviews also routinely equated the Shakers with New England Puritans, racializing them as the most desirable so-called old stock of white Anglo-Protestant Americans. Commentators repeatedly delighted in how index images, such as this one that you see here, Elizabeth Moutal's rendering of a Shaker woman's bonnet, revealed the beauty of Puritan austerity. As Fortune magazine extolled in its 1937 caption for this image, the index demonstrated, quote, that the romantic debunkers of the 20s were all wrong about Puritanism. Puritanism was not responsible for the lack of popular art in America. For, quote, the Shakers of New England who made this butternut silk bonnet arrived at functionalism by way of fundamentalism, end quote. This conflation of the Shakers with Puritans worked to obscure the most radical aspects of the religious sect, such as its celibacy, gender equity, and communal property, in order to emphasize more stereotypically Puritan traits like hard work and simplicity. At the same time, index accounts of the Shakers consistently emphasized their English roots through the leadership of Mother Ann Lee and obscured the ways that Shakers were ostracized in early American society. The celebration of Shaker design in this period thus needs to be understood not only as the search by modernists for American aesthetic origins, but also as the search by white Americans for an exemplary racial origin, for a group that could embody such fabled attributes of whiteness as restraint, industriousness, and beauty. Indeed, like other costume renderings from the index, Shaker woman's bonnet appears to be arranged around the ghost of such an idealized white body, whose imagined presence seems to animate the clothing with a highly racialized sense of gentility. Like other index images, I think this one encourages viewers to imagine touching, using, and in this case, wearing the historical object, enabling them to feel themselves to be part of an American history that is being coded as white. More surprising was the index's celebration of so-called Spanish colonial art from the Southwest, which at first would seem to contradict the project's emphasis on whiteness. For this was one of the few areas where index organizers included art made by American Indians, and they repeatedly characterized its hybridity of Spanish and Indian style as a, quote, distinctive blend of Baroque and primitive forms. Yet by labeling this Southwestern art Spanish, the index took part in a re-racialization of Hispano-Americans in the Southwest as white Euro-Americans with, quote, Spanish blood, rather than brown Mexican Americans of mixed race. A distinction between wealthy so-called Spanish landowners and landless so-called Mexican peasants had long been operating throughout the Southwest and Texas and California under the axiom that, quote, money whitens. But in the early 20th century, the Spanish identity was extended to poorer populations. The movement for New Mexico statehood largely prompted and politically required this shift, in which New Mexico was now celebrated as a remote area where an authentic Spanish language and folk art had been preserved over centuries. The index's embrace of Southwest art was thus distinct from other practices of cultural promotion in the region that we might be more familiar with. Unlike members of the Taos art colony, for example, who promoted Pueblo Indian culture, or Americans who embraced Mexican modernism and indigenous crafts, the index's inclusion of Southwest art did not reject European precedents in favor of Native American models, but rather idealized an American folk art for its authentically European roots. Indeed, Jennifer McLaren has shown how Indian art of the Southwest was excluded from the so-called folk art made by those of European descent. This hierarchy of Euro-American folk over American Indians was articulated explicitly in a press release issued by the Museum of Modern Art to promote the index as part of its 1936 exhibition, New Horizons in American Art. The release quotes Donald Baer, director of the Denver Art Museum and the regional director of the index in the Southwest, as saying, quote, "The art of the Spanish colonial period is one of the great folk arts of the world. It is an art which may be looked upon as even more legitimate material and more traditional to this section than the art of the American Indian, which is a race alien in blood to our culture," end quote. Moreover, to the extent that art made by American Indians was given visibility as part of the index's Southwestern material, it was consistently presented as having been made under Spanish tutelage or, quote, inspiration to minimize Indian agency and reinforce a romanticized history of Spanish colonists as benign protectors of native peoples. In this way, the index contributed to the rehabilitation of Spanish colonization from the so-called Black legend that had long served as a foil for Anglo-American imperialism to a more modern Ramona-esque fantasy. Indeed, writers largely ignored the Catholic context of the bultos and santos included in the index, focusing instead on their craftsmanship. The St. Ignatius figure rendered by Karl Oberg, for example, was described by the Honolulu Star Bulletin only as, quote, "carved from cottonwood and painted over a gesso ground." Such objects, together with the painted chests, embroidered suspenders, and ornate saddles illustrated in other news accounts of the index's so-called Spanish material, offered a colorful, vibrant alternative to the austerity of Shaker, or so-called Puritan design. Yet the contrast between these and other works in the index only strengthened its construction of American art as both pleasingly diversified and stably unified by its European roots. The conflation of Spanish with Southwest, like the conflation of Shaker with Puritan, reified the whiteness of these contributions to the index, and hence the whiteness of American art and national identity. Viewers describe feeling as if they could touch the objects represented in index drawings, and indeed exhibition visitors reportedly did touch the drawings many times in order to verify that they were actually looking at two-dimensional representations instead of the object itself. Similarly, Colonial Williamsburg impressed viewers with the reality effect of its reconstruction of the past. These uncanny designs encouraged Americans to imagine that they could feel the past through their bodily senses, to feel as if the history put on display was a naturally occurring and factual reality, less created than captured, as Brock put it in the New York Times. Yet what they captured was less the past than the racial ideologies of the present, a time when white Americans across regions and backgrounds were unifying around a shared sense of racial superiority that underpinned their national identity. Thank you.
Okay, so our next panelist is Professor Jennifer Greenhill, and she is the Endowed Professor of American Art at the University of Arkansas and the Director of Graduate Studies and Museum Partnerships with the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. She earned her PhD from Yale University and previously held tenured positions at the University of Illinois and the University of Southern California. Jennifer Greenhill is the author of Playing It Straight, Art and Humor in the Gilded Age, and a co-editor of A Companion to American Art. Her current book project studies how research in psychology impacted the visual techniques of suggestive advertising at the turn of the 20th century. And it addresses artists, companies, and theorists, such as Maxfield Parrish, Kodak, and Hugo Münsterberg. This spring, the Archives of American Art Journal will publish The Art of Commercial Archives, a methodological piece that addresses strategies for working creatively with the materials contained in commercial repositories. And I'm really looking forward to reading that piece. So today she'll present a paper called Politics at the Beach. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jennifer.
I want to thank Louis and Maddie for organizing this terrific conference and thinking about my research for it. In the summer of 2019, an editor at The Atlantic asked me to write about the pro-Trump Utah-based painter John McNaughton. After spending more hours than I care to admit studying McNaughton's work, I made the case that he uses the template and luster of history painting to prop up a practice of meme making that is precisely calibrated to fit the rancor, polarization, and absurdity of social media discourse. McNaughton's references to historical art play an important role in legitimizing his work for its target audience of MAGA, that is, Make America Great Again supporters, but not because he holds true to the work's original meanings or context. Those who like and circulate McNaughton's images have no real concern for Goya, for example, whose 3rd of May McNaughton recast by putting a MAGA hat wearer in the position of the Spanish martyr captured by a Napoleonic firing squad, parts now played by masked, hoodied, and stick-wielding Antifa aggressors. It is an irreverent treatment of the historical precedent that privileges the iconography of the political present, clothing social media vitriol in something that is ostensibly more refined and enduring, in the vein of timeless traditional values vaguely construed, precisely what the MAGA movement holds dear. McNaughton walks a fine line, of course, between high drama and humor in these mashups, and it's no surprise that he's been called, quote, the most consistently funny artist working today, end quote. I found this little assignment interesting because it gave me a chance to think about the role historical art plays in contemporary political discourse. Why is art such a convenient ground for the formulation of political utterances, particularly in the context of popular media? Put another way, why does McNaughton need Goya's history painting for a critique of Antifa? Why did Gal Gadot and friends turn to John Lennon's Imagine to express solidarity for the suffering in a time of crisis? I mean, it's a great song, but what purpose did it serve? What role did the Frick Museum's art collection play in the recent J.R. and Timothy Chalamet collab, which endeavored to tackle American social tensions by having the actor rip through a paper banner decorated with the American flag to meander through the galleries? Quote, we enter into an American flag to find a place, an identity, a position, a future between the stripes and the stars, J.R. explained of his take on the 2021 Met Gala theme of American independence. The performance was live streamed on Instagram, official Met Gala sponsor. To get to the end, he said, we need to confront our rifts, our flaws, those of our nation, of our family, and our own cracks, which have been amplified by 2 years of loneliness, anger, fear, confrontation, end quote. The historical artworks on display at the Frick, Rococo paintings of leisurely afternoons in bucolic nature and impressionist scenes of, well, the same, seem to serve as both pathway and reward, offering reparative visual pleasure as an antidote to social division. But instead of underscoring the seriousness of the perilous quest narrative the artist had choreographed, the cream puff aesthetic of the Rococo as a visual language of insouciant privilege only made it appear that much more contrived. I'm interested in what happens when historical art has more presence than might be expected in such stagings, when it cannot be fully managed by one or another political agenda in the present. What is produced politically, I'm wondering, when the hum of the historical can be heard, introducing feedback on some other frequency from another time? What can the use and sometimes abuse of historical art tell us about the political needs of the present? I want to consider these questions by now turning to the Pageant of the Masters, an annual living picture show in Laguna Beach, California, launched by local artists in the early 1930s to draw tourists to the area. So the Olympic Games had just taken place in LA, 50 miles north of this sleepy art colony. It is a form of reenactment with roots in the ancient world and has maintained a cult following, perhaps in part because it stands in opposition to the digital economy I have so far been discussing. Photography and videotaping are strictly prohibited. Though last summer, one journalist linked the pageant to the low-tech restaging of art by people who responded to the art in quarantine challenge posed by various museums seeking to connect digitally with absent audiences. The two-act show, which runs for 60 consecutive nights each summer, roughly from the 4th of July to Labor Day, in a theater seating 2,600, typically runs for about an hour and a half and includes a live orchestra and extensive narration in booming avuncular tones. And it's perhaps worth noting that the pageant necessarily privileges figurative art, since abstract works pose a challenge to recreation. The show almost always ends with Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper since 1936, and tickets can be pricey, over $100 for the best seats, which may be why the pageant has been parodied as a kitschy spectacle for Orange County socialites. But this is outdoor community theater in a beach town, and one tends to see more flip-flops than fine attire. This is not to say that audience members do not take the show seriously. Many demonstrate their commitment by coming back year after year, as do the volunteers playing the parts on stage. Pageant organizers maintain that they have no political point to make, and in recent years, they have explicitly framed the entertainment as a respite from political divisions. But the effort to situate art apart from the political, using it to reparative ends by literally immobilizing and aestheticizing community members in idealized portrayals of hard work, noble suffering, and resilience, of course, has its politics. And what you're seeing at center and right are the photographer Matthew Rolston's portraits of pageant volunteers, part of an exhibition entitled Art People, held at the Laguna Art Museum in 2021, which effectively extended the popular entertainment's terrain to the local art museum. Art is central to community identity in Laguna Beach, and the pageant is accompanied by a competitive art fair, the Festival of Arts, comprised of local artists selected by jury to sell their works in spaces adjacent to the pageant. And what you do is you go early to the show, get a glass of wine, and meander through the stalls. The non-juried Sawdust Art Festival is held across the street to support local artists. And then there is the Art Affair, which does not have a local residency requirement. And you can see on the map where all of these opportunities to engage with art as both entertainment and commodity are located in a neighborhood rich in galleries, about a 20-minute walk or 6 blocks from the ocean. One sculptor's proposal to create low-rent live workspace for artists has stirred up tensions, complicating Laguna's commitment to contemporary artists, as homeowners and environmentalists worry about property values, the natural ecosystem, parking, and increased traffic to the area on the narrow State Route 133, the main road to the beach. The median property value in Laguna is 1.77 million. The community is overwhelmingly white, and the median age is about 50. It has historically had a strong LGBTQ+ presence and tends to vote Democratic, with 63% of residents voting along that party line in 2020 and 59% in 2016. There's very strong Republican sentiment in broader Orange County, however, which tends to be more evenly split. The pageant draws over 80% of its volunteers from outside of Laguna Beach, and it seems plausible, if not probable, that their political views are mixed. Diane Chalice Davey, who has directed the pageant for 25 years, chose the theme for 2020, Made in America, Trailblazing Artists and Their Stories, which ultimately had to be deferred until 2021, because she thought, quote, we as Americans needed to feel good about our artists and heritage and have pride in what they've done, end quote. And at center, you're seeing the list of artworks selected for this purpose from the show program. The pageant director said she, quote, had a gut instinct that 2020 would be a rough year with the news media, politics, and the divisions. So as with JR's Met Gala piece, art in the 2021 pageant was offered as a reward for resilience, offering reparative visual pleasure as an antidote to political discord. The pandemic cancellation of 2020 was the first since World War II, when the show went dark for 3 years. And the connection between that period of anxiety and deprivation of our own was made explicit from the show's opening, which raised the American flag on a 1940s style flagpole to the tune of the national anthem. The goal was to make people, quote, appreciate the music and the sentiment and take all the politics out of it, end quote. The predominantly white multi-generational audience in attendance on a Monday night in August when I saw the show seemed to appreciate the invitation to leave the divisive rancor of the news cycle behind, to be enveloped by feel-good patriotic storytelling. Spontaneous applause erupted with the appearance of national icons and works of art devoted to resilience in troubling times. These included John Trumbull's Declaration of Independence, Daniel Chester French's Seated Lincoln, the Statue of Liberty, and Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms. So although monuments to white supremacy are coming down nationwide and indeed around the world, monuments are not contested forms within the pageant. There were a lot of them. Rockwell's World War II era series, which was phenomenally successful in galvanizing Americans in support of the war effort, were projected on stage before 3 recreations of little-known Rockwell magazine covers, which fell flat in comparison because they failed to catch the mood. Returning to the pageant in 2021 was presented as a momentous and important undertaking, and the imagery that seemed to please the crowd most tapped into that feeling and the enduring myth of American exceptionalism, the sort of thinking that, in the context of a living picture show, could turn a global pandemic into a local story of triumph against all odds. A can-do spirit infused with American dream thinking informed the 2021 show throughout, but it was most palpable when the narrative turned to minoritized artists who had triumphed over adversity to be enfolded in the national story. Pageant organizers did some, what I would describe as light truth-telling about gender inequality and racism, quoting the sculptor Edmonia Lewis on the hypocrisies of the so-called land of liberty, for example. One journalist breathlessly described what she learned at the pageant about Lewis, concluding, quote, "The fierce spirit that drives artists to make art despite entrenched bias and injustices is in large part what makes 2021's pageant so uplifting," end quote. And this is the text that you see at the right. Pain and suffering are the preconditions for uplift, and Lewis is presented as, like her Cleopatra, a tragic but noble figure who sculpted politicians like Grant despite her mistreatment by the American political system. She's thus presented as endorsing that system through her art. The same could be said of John Nieto, the late Santa Fe-based artist of Apache and Spanish descent, although I should note that his gallery does not claim any tribal affiliation. Fancy Dancer with Flag was the work selected to close out the show before the Last Supper, with voiceover narration describing Nieto as, quote, "a true American original who knew the world of his forefathers, spoke not only to the present, but to the future," end quote. The script attempts to signal respect for Indigenous knowledge while simultaneously erasing it by making Nieto over as a true American, whose dancer against a backdrop of stars and stripes reads as an endorsement of the outcomes of settler colonialism. In this way, the work acted as bookend to George Caleb Bingham's Boone escorting settlers through the Cumberland Gap. Bingham was presented as the show's first example of trailblazing. Pageant organizers may not have been fully conscious of the neoliberal ideology that informs their commoditization of inclusion and promotion of autonomy, self-invention, and self-expression over the collective. But at least one journalist picked up on this, noting how the show, quote, "tempers its art and cultural history narrative in a way that is inclusive, diverse, while at the same time reflecting a certain pride in American values and our history of ingenuity and creativity. If that sounds hard to pull off, it is," end quote. There were many moments when the strain was felt, most palpably for me, when this work, William Sidney Mount's Power of Music, erupted into a literal jig. The late 1840s genre painting shows the interior of a barn as a privileged space for white community that coheres around music and stands apart from and literally higher than the Black laborer who listens in from outside. Figuring music's power to bridge the divide, the painting's composition is nevertheless informed by the racist hierarchies of the mid-19th century, segregating Black from white, which it naturalizes through Mount's convincing realism. But pageant narration read that figure as a stand-in for Anthony Clapp, presented as the painter's neighbor who taught him to play the fiddle, although Clapp was enslaved by Mount's uncle and died during Mount's childhood. And with that biographical misrepresentation, which seems to have been a calculated invention to dispel the specter of slavery that haunts the painting, pageant narration remade the work's politics, bringing the protagonists together outside the space of the composition to dance a jig downstage. This went on for about 2 minutes, uninterrupted by narration, and it was a rare instance of the pageant breaking from living pictures petrifaction to draw movement directly out of a reenacted artwork. This seemed an effortful attempt to distract not simply from the logic of the 19th century work, but also from how that logic reverberates in the present. Just imagine how this scene would have registered if the show had debuted as intended during the summer of 2020. Kicking off a section celebrating, quote, the roots of American popular music, end quote. The jig prompted me to consider that context too, and the restrictions placed on Black talent, as dancers expected to jump and jive in Hollywood films, as musicians condescended to while touring the segregated South, and as the originators of musical styles taken up and claimed by white imitators who made a killing. The awkwardness of this interlude, I think, testifies to the power of the historical artwork, whose politics could not be fully managed by pageant organizers. The impromptu dance was made more cringeworthy by animating the genre painting in the context of American musical history. In so doing, organizers ended up redoubling the complication that I think they had sought to evade by launching into that jig in the first place. They could have easily avoided complex artworks that risked compromising their messaging, but instead they recanonized and repurposed them. In this case, one felt the labor of cultural amnesia that such repurposing requires. And I think this struck me so viscerally because labor was everywhere made in America. There were all sorts of workers, white collar and blue, the better to underscore the ethic of hard work that is so ingrained in American senses of self. And I'm reminded here of something Peggy Phelan writes in Unmarked, The Politics of Performance, quote, "You're welcome here as long as you are productive," end quote. The pageant played on the theme most memorably with a recreation of Dwayne Hanson's life-size laborers on a lunch break, a mixed media piece from 1989 designed to simulate real flesh and blood. The volunteers who played the parts had an easier task than those cast to play the bronze cowboys of Frederick Remington, for example, or the marble queen of Lewis's Cleopatra. All they had to do for lunch break was dress the part, since their own skin did a superlative job of simulating Hanson's sculpture. It was a wry nod to the mechanics of a living picture show, constituting a break from the more labor-intensive reenactments. The 2021 pageant used Winslow Homer's Breezing Up as its behind-the-scenes, how it's done example, showing how the illusion is constructed and eliciting oohs and ahs as the children were transformed by makeup, costumes, lighting, and so on into a static two-dimensional image. The immobilization of bodies and illusionistic flattening into image go hand in hand with the nostalgic backward glance the pageant serves up as a fortifying break from contemporary concerns. Put away your cell phones and remember what it was like to live in a simpler time before all the interruptions and the frantic pace, the pageant's director advised in 2015, explaining the rationale behind that year's theme, the pursuit of happiness. The layers of paint applied to community members who volunteer over 60,000 hours each summer attest to the artistry that goes into engineering happiness. By sacrificing their time and bodies to the cause, volunteers get to live those great artistic statements as a kind of alternate reality. The predominantly white and high earning community may lack diversity, but it can ritually perform inclusion and diversity via representation. And by annually performing art appreciation, the community secures its hold on the category of art colony without requiring further demonstration in the way of affordable housing for living artists, for example. Things get interesting when the historical art recruited for this purpose exceeds the stage management that would extinguish its politics. And I wonder how this plays out in the context of other spaces of learning, art appreciation, and national myth-making. I haven't fleshed this all out, but the spaces I'm thinking about are public school classrooms, including but not exclusively those legislating feel-good storytelling about American history. I'm thinking about exhibitions dedicated to American art and the perennial concerns about engaging audiences and activating the past and wall label copy that can't possibly say it all, and programming that entertains maybe a little bit more than it educates. Perhaps we could even put conferences like this one in the mix and ask what overarching story about the American political imagination our various contributions have begun to delineate. I think our topics and the questions we've asked of our materials speak powerfully to the priorities of this moment. And I wonder what sort of history we have constructed about the political deeds of the present for a bunch of scholars convening virtually in London, about as far away geographically from a California beach town as you could get. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was fascinating, and I can't wait to delve into it even further during the Q&A. So I'd like to invite all three speakers to join us back on screen, and we've got about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. And for the audience, if you could just pop your questions into the chat box, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. Okay, so I thought I would just get us started by thanking you all again. And it was really incredible to see the crossover between all three papers. And they spoke to one another in really rich ways. So in all three papers, we saw these large scale public displays reperforming the past to actualize new realities for the future. And in that, we see issues of temporality and this strategic collapse between the past and the present. And with Kay and Wendy, you both touched upon the colonial revival of the early 20th century. Wendy, you discussed the supposed destruction of the George III statue and some issues of iconoclasm, while Kay was speaking to the issues of reconstruction of the past with Colonial Williamsburg. So there's this kind of two sides of the same coin with the destruction and reconstruction. And I was wondering if the two of you might respond to one another's papers and your takes on Colonial Williamsburg and George III and this early, the revival of colonialism in the early 20th century.
Sure. Kay, would you like to go first since you spoke most recently?
No, you go ahead. I'm curious to see what you think.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Francesca. There's a lot of ways in which these two papers and projects speak to one another. And I think, you know, the 1930s, although I did not speak to it explicitly today in my paper, plays a really important part in this story of the reiterative appearances of George III and the way in which he's constantly caught up with historical memory and a sort of haunting and doubling of George Washington as well. So increasingly throughout the 19th century and right through the 1930s, which are marked by these nationwide celebrations of the birth of George Washington, George III and George Washington are sort of held in tension with one another. I mean, there's this way in which George III is always falling and George Washington is always arising to take his place. That process in many ways begins much earlier in the 19th century. But what I would say here with regard to Kay's paper and the focus on the 1930s in particular is the way in which, Kay, you spoke so beautifully to a shared imaginary of whiteness that effectively brings Northerners and Southerners together at this geographical midpoint as well, at the space of Virginia and Colonial Williamsburg, and the way in which the United States is remaking itself at that particular location in a very particular racialized way. And it's a process that I see happening in representations of iconoclasm, starting with the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia, which really kicks off the beginning of the Colonial Revival in the United States. And what happens over the course of generations of visual representations of iconoclasm is that the crowds themselves get whiter and whiter. So people of color, indigenous people, and also women start to get evacuated from the crowds in scenes of iconoclastic destruction, so that by the 1930s, what we have at this really important moment of people coming together to imagine what this national imaginary is, a political imaginary, we have a story of iconoclasm that itself has been quite literally whitewashed through representations. So that's one area where I see even more connection between our papers than I think we were able to address today.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. That's so interesting. One thing I was thinking about during your talk was the way Williamsburg too really highlights this kind of Anglophilia and Francophilia of Americans in this period. That's really one of the explicit goals of Colonial Williamsburg, to kind of show the strong connections between, you know, Britain, France, and the soon-to-be U.S. In the 18th century. And part of the impetus behind that is, of course, the problems in Europe, right, and the kind of looming threat of war. There's this very strong desire to kind of show historical connection and present solidarity with Britain and France. And so, you know, I think it's interesting to think about, you know, kind of that happening over a spectrum of time, right? As the US becomes kind of more and more invested in European conflicts, but also, right, as European immigration kind of, you know, kind of forces Americans to kind of have a more expansive idea of whiteness. And something that really struck me about all of our talks, right, is this kind of emphasis on the past as a picture, right, that can be kind of, you know, manipulated, but shown to people as if it's, you know, so real, and this kind of fascination with presenting the kind of realness of the representation. And so that's just something that I'm very interested in with Williamsburg, the way that the architects, the designers really described their job as creating a picture of the past. And they're very, kind of overt about that, I guess.
Thank you. And yeah, speaking of picturing the past, Louis Shadwick has a question for Jennifer. So Louis wrote, "Thank you so much for such a fascinating paper, which has spoken to so many different interesting questions about national myth making that I've been thinking about. I was really interested to see 2 Edward Hopper paintings included in the pageant, having written my PhD on Hopper. I was wondering why you think Hopper's Nighthawks is so often presented as an emphatically American image, as it seems to have been again here. What is it about that image that seems to describe Americanness for so many people? And what do you think are the connotations of this identification?"
Well, Louis, thank you for that question, but you know, you're the expert on Hopper. I mean, I have some thoughts, but I know you do too. And I think in the context of the pageant, at least, it really just operated as a kind of iconic painting that people in the audience knew. There were some oohs and ahs around the appearance of that one too. And interestingly, the director of the pageant chose that painting for to insert herself, to have a portrait of herself made within that tableau, which I think is really interesting and may go to your point that it has that iconic quality, but maybe associated to American culture in the early 40s. I always think about it in the context of film noir. None of this is original, but I would love to hear Louis' thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe the 2 of you will continue that conversation. So another question for Jennifer actually comes from Wendy. And she wrote, "I noticed that a few of the paintings included on the program for Made in America are compositions that are featured Indigenous figures, most obviously the Budmer Bison Dance of the Mandan, but also Bingham's Fur Traders, which includes a child of mixed race descent. Related to your excellent analysis of Mount's power of music, can you speak to how the pageant represented Native American figures in the Budmer, etc.? Thinking here of the long and problematic history of playing Indian in American art and performance histories from Catlin onward."
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for the fur traders, the figures were described as father and son, simply. So that more complex history totally elided. Which gels with, you know, the way in which they're interpreting other works. But for the Bodmer, I mean, it probably is exactly what you would expect, framing that in the context of European fascination with native cultures. And then I transcribed the narration, so I have actually notes on what they said, that they describe the figures as fiercely proud tribesmen of the plain. So this heroic native figure, that was stressed, but then the music, the orchestral accompaniment went into what I found to be a cringeworthy evocation of the tribal, of drumming. So very much framed in relationship to the way the other works are framed.
Thank you. And then we have one from John Fagg to Wendy. And he writes, the Hudson Fulton celebration was also a manifestation of what Annette Stock calls Holland mania. The early 20th century turned to the Dutch Republic as an alternate European point of origin, recognizing Hudson as a representative of the Dutch East India Company and the history of New Amsterdam. Hudson, the Met held a blockbuster exhibition of Dutch 17th century painting to mark the event. How does this strain of period thinking relate to your emphasis on the colonial revival attention to Englishness?
That's such a great question. Thank you, John. And I will admit that in the broader project, I hadn't given much attention to thinking about this particular question, the way in which Dutch history is registered or not registered throughout the ways in which iconoclasm is represented. And I think in my answer right there might be part of the answer to your question, which is to say that consistently throughout depictions and reenactments of iconoclasm, it is a British American story that is told. And one that I think very much serves the interests then of the primarily Anglo-American constituency that sponsored and that realized the Hudson Fulton. There are other ways, though, I think, in which there's much more complicated ways of historians and artists throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries circling back to Dutch history in various ways. And one of them, of course, is the Knickerbocker stories and parables of Washington Irving, the iconic story of Rip Van Winkle, which is very much a story of a Dutch past, or at least the setting for that. Those Rip Van Winkle stories are often in a much older Dutch moment of colonization. And finally, and kind of interestingly, Bowling Green itself is a site that has been contested in terms of being a space for public sculpture truly since the 18th century. So it begins as in its colonial manifestations as a Dutch parade ground and as a space for a Dutch market. That history is almost forgotten at a very early stage of British colonization on Manhattan Island. But what happens by the early 20th century is that a sculpture of Peter Stuyvesant, I believe, it might not be Stuyvesant, it might have been another Dutch founder, but in any case, a very large sculpture of a Dutch founder is in place in Bowling Green by the end of the 19th century. And it's not there anymore. And in fact, if you visit Bowling Green today, the Dutch history of that space is not recognized publicly at all. It is only a history of American Revolution that is publicly recognized through signage at that state. In that space. But there's numerous postcards from around the turn of the 19th century that do show this Dutch sculpture there. So I think I'd like to think more about your question. It's terrific. But those are some ways in which I think the visibility or invisibility of Dutch history is registered through visual culture.
Thank you. So I think we have time. We have just about 1 minute left. So we have one more question for all three panelists coming from Richard. And he says, I'm impressed by the performative, vernacular, and otherwise unpredictable nature of your objects of study. I'm wondering if your scholarship marks a post-painting American art history. nice concluding question.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for that question. I guess I would say I hope so, or nothing against painting, but yeah, I think one of the interesting things about my topic is the way a lot of the sort of debates from that period about America's kind of conservatism, it's sort of quasi-fascism in the period are really about kind of regionalist painting, right? And these kind of debates over whether the American turn in painting is actually good or bad from a kind of leftist political agenda. And yeah, it strikes me that all these design projects, which are getting like a ton of investment, are being rather overlooked kind of within the period and certainly subsequently in terms of their kind of politics. So so I do think this is a kind of an area that is ripe for investigation. But I think American art has always been kind of more interested in the non-painting, right, than other fields of art history, which is one of the reasons why it's so rich.
Well, and I think something that makes our projects, speak to one another in such interesting ways is the way in which we're moving back and forth between high art, including painting and other sorts of materials. And that's really critical for something like the Pageant of the Masters, which is really invested in that, to go to Madeline's question that I guess we don't have time for, to that stilling effect of painting and what that means as an intervention in the contemporary, in the flow of time in the present. So I guess I would never really see my own work and treatment of even virtual spaces. We've seen amazing scholarship on that earlier today, as ever being post-painting, but I think I understand the context for your question and just the capaciousness of the materials that we're very happy to address.
And I would add to what Jennifer has said by agreeing. I think that even if the history of American art as a subfield of the discipline has long engaged with media other than painting, and in that regard might be post-painting in terms of its methodology and historiographies, that I think that all three of our papers today really suggest the way in which painting as a medium and the kind of canonical hierarchy it continues to occupy, not just for art historians, but within a public imagination, continues to inform newer ways of representing the American past. And with that in mind, Richard Herbert asked a question early on as to whether augmented reality would see the creation of or recreations of the statue of George III. And there I would just mention that even though that's not happening in this New York Historical Society exhibition, it has happened elsewhere. And virtual reality and interactive versions of this act of iconoclasm have appeared in the past at the New York Historical Society. And the very first gallery of a new museum in Philadelphia called the Museum of the American Revolution also includes a highly interactive video in which the sculpture actually puts you at the base of the pedestal and it seems like it's coming down almost on top of you. And painting, specifically painting, including the Fertel painting that I discussed, remains the touchstone for those video reenactments. So in that way, I agree with Jennifer. I think that painting continues to inform the kind of performative spaces and representations that are so powerful, no matter what kind of medium we see them being expressed in.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's fascinating, and I think we could continue talking for much longer. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you again for your brilliant papers, and we're going to hand it back to Louis and Maddie now.
Bring us towards the end of today. But I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone today for all your papers. They've all been so insightful, and each of them has enriched and expanded our understandings of how the American political imagination is made manifest through our visual and our material culture. We hope that you'll feel that you're leaving here with a deepened understanding of how America's political imagination is formulated, how it's challenged, and how it's disseminated through images and objects. And we're so grateful for all your questions and your participation across the 2 days. I'd also just like to thank our panel chairs for their great job. You've all added so much to this conference and been wonderful moderators. So I'll just hand over to Maddie for some final words, and thank you again, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I just want also to add my thanks to the Courtaulds Research Forum team, especially Acacia and Grace, who've been working away, often invisibly, behind the scenes over the last few days, and indeed for the last few months, to make sure this conference will go smoothly. We couldn't have done it without them. And we would also like to really sincerely thank David Peters Corbett, who has, as always, has been constantly supportive and enthusiastic for this conference. And a huge thank you as well to the Terra Foundation for American Art for helping to bring this conference to life. We're really grateful for everyone's support, and yeah, I'd like to echo Louis' thanks to everyone for such brilliant papers, such illuminating questions. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for giving up your Saturday. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and let's hope that it's just as sunny and gorgeous as it has been in London today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.